Hallo, liebe Menschen auf der Republika.
Dear humans at the Republica, I'm grateful to be with you, even if it's just via video. Do you know what is actually being fought against in Ukraine? It's a strange question to ask yourself in earnest. Self-contradictory Russian propaganda aside, what is actually so worthy of being destroyed in a country like Ukraine? When I was there in 2013 and 14, I got a pretty good impression. 30,000 people came to the Maidan Square in Kiev and just stayed there. They came because they were angry about police brutality, about corruption, about promises that have been broken time and time again. It was a little bit like the revolution in 2004, but also completely different. This time, they didn't fight for a new president. This time, people were fighting for themselves. Pretty quickly, a self-organization manifested itself on the square. A so-called kitchen squad organized the supply of warm meals. A medical unit treated everyone living on the square for free. 4 completely functional operating rooms were created in a church. The artistic squad painted police riot shields, recited poems and sang songs, and played guitar by the fireside at night. People were sweeping the streets, tidied up and supplied other people with anything they needed. The city's civil society had woken up and hacked the city. And this was happening in a country where people frequently used to say they would phone up the president when the garbage bin was broken. After decades of authoritarian Soviet defiance, where you had very good reason to be skeptical about your neighbor and to look out for yourself, people were remembering their ability to organize themselves and help each other out directly. When you could read in the social media of St. Petersburg and Moscow for the first time, hey, take a look at what the Ukrainians are doing. Couldn't we do that ourselves? That was the moment when Putin invaded Ukraine, because he understood one thing very well. Democracy is very contagious. The notion of not being completely at the mercy of the world is one of the most powerful feelings in the world. In that sense, this war, at its core, is a war of an old worldview against a new one. Putin's authoritarian conception from the industrial age, where people were supposed to be happy when they just had a job and materially taken care of, against a democratic societal order that was just emerging in Ukraine. While we are still in the painful transition process from the industrial age into the information age, the internal logic of power is changing. In the information age, it is less relevant who owns natural resources and the means to produce material things. On the other hand, the means necessary to produce labor, like AI, automation and so on, are becoming much more vital. The ability to solve problems, to shape processes, creativity and interpersonal capabilities gain much more importance. The idea of constant production and infinite growth is being questioned as well. Our world is finite after all. We are still in the process of negotiation what this postmodern age will look like, who will hold the power. One thing is clear though, it's not going to be the oil dictators or dictatorships, at least if we as a society want to survive. In that sense, this war is also a part of and a symbol for the fight of something old against something new. A turn of the eras, if you will. However, I don't believe Germany growing its military is not what this turning point calls for. The essence of this sea change is the necessity to face the realities of the world we now live in. For too long, we have received cheap resources from Russia and we ignored the price of our own safety, our autonomy and the future of our children. For too long, we have paid for the profits of a few powerful gatekeepers from the wealth of all of humanity. For too long, we have viewed whole nations in Eastern Europe as bargaining chips in negotiations with Russia. This war in Ukraine should be a wake-up call. A wake-up call showing that solidarity works. Both the private solidarity of humans in the aid for refugees and the aid in Ukraine, as well as the solidarity of nations who can be powerful if they act together according to moral principles. It should show the European community that measures can be decided upon by majority rule without individual nations putting in their veto. It should show that our security and information policy shouldn't be German, but rather European, in order to be effective in a world torn between China, Russia, and the US with its uncertain future. That national regionalism is not going to get us anywhere. That freedom has a price and that international law needs to be enforced if it is to be worth anything. The only hope for peace we have. Authoritarian nations are not islands. They are well connected and support each other with money, protection from sanctions, disinformation, campaigns and agitation. Are democratic nations working together as effectively as well? And where is Germany in all of this? 2014, Putin tested where the West is at and how they would react. He annexed a part of Ukraine. Even back then, there were fights over Mariupol. The West decided to appease Putin. Parts of Ukraine were de facto conceded, and a peace treaty that froze the conflict over was brokered with German involvement. A few sanctions were ratified and then immediately subverted. Putin thus was successful back then. He had more land than before and more popular domestically than ever before. Over the years, he could strengthen his troops, use the occupied territory, and at last push forward again. Did we learn our lesson from 2014? I'm not really convinced we did. In the beginning, the West's reaction was swift and decisive, but soon after it became apparent that Germany is among the countries that put their foot on the brake when it comes to joint actions. At first, when the financial sanctions were imposed, later on, with regards to military support with Ukraine, again and again there were calls for an immediate peace deal. What would that entail? The conflict would be frozen again. Putin would have gained more land, areas where people cannot live in peace and safety anymore, where civilians are subject to rape, torture and murder, where concentration camps are being built, areas that Russia can incorporate to its national territory, and where the next attack in a few years can be staged and prepared for. It's a vicious circle from hell. What could be the alternative? Ukraine has shown and shows daily at the moment that they have the military capability to push back the Russian forces. In some areas, even as far back as the Russian border. But in order to win back its own territory and save its own citizens, they need heavy ordnance. They need those heavy weapons so Putin cannot resolve the situation with a win for himself, and to avoid sending a signal to all other nations in the world that wars of aggression can pay off. Even just for this reason, Ukraine needs to win, and this means Putin must not be allowed to gain even the smallest piece of land at this time. Are we doing anything to help Ukraine? Well, Poland, the Baltics, and all the other states that are immediately threatened by Russia and Putin are doing their utmost to help out and deliver anything they have to help Ukraine. They see themselves in a common fight. The US and the UK are also promising material by the ton and are already supplying some of it. And what about us? We're just making promises. We are giving Ukraine money that they're not allowed to buy heavy weapons they need for. The Office of the Chancellor ignores export permits on their desks for weeks amidst the race for time during a phase where the war could be expedited. If only Ukraine were enabled to apply pressure. Instead, the Chancellor and the French President are talking to Putin for hours, as if phone calls would do anything to change his mind and get him to the negotiating table, all the while he could win militarily as long as the West is hesitant. as long as the West is divided, as long as they're afraid for their gas supply. In April, Ukrainian experts said that with the promised ordnance, they might actually be able to push Russian forces back by June. But in large part, the delivery of said material never happened, and Ukraine, by their estimate, gets just enough weaponry to not lose, but also just not enough to win. Now we have to prepare for a long, long war. Probably that has been the goal in the heads of several Western strategists all along. To bog down Russia for a long time in Ukraine and to economically wear it down. What happens to the humans in Ukraine is secondary in this deliberation. And while the war rages on and more people are dying every day, we're getting numb to it. The media circus is moving on. The pressure on the chancellor and his office is waning. And thus, Germany can stay in the comfortable position to hardly restrict itself, not take any decision, and to not take a stance. As long as we mutter words of solidarity, hold concerts with Ukrainian orchestras, and ban Russian afflicts, it's easy to believe that we are part of the good ones. I won't lie. Now more than ever, it's painful for me to be both Ukrainian and German at the same time, because it's hard to reconcile at the moment. The cynicism, the mercantilism, and the short-sightedness that often rule global politics are hurting me. However, sometimes you can be completely disheartened and carry on at the same time. If there's one thing I can learn from my friends in the Ukraine right now, it is how they wake up, they get up, and they carry on every time in one of the darkest hours. How they maintain their sense of humor, beauty, art, and solidarity. How they improvise and they help each other. How they remain human. It's so easy to forget that humanity over recessions and gas prices and security councils, that deep truth underlying all these things, that a war of aggression is unjust and evil, that would be stupid to let someone get away with it, that freedom and democracy have to be defended, that we need to stand together, that is so fundamentally true that every child understands it. That is why we don't give up. The fight for peace, the fight against climate catastrophe, the fight against poverty and racism, against state and corporate surveillance, they can all wear you down, but they all can be fought together in solidarity, determined and with conviction. Never was inaction as dangerous as it is now, and I refuse to do it. And to all of you fighting, I wish you strength and suggest success from all my heart.